Hi, I'm Professor Angus Kress Gillespie, your host on East Brunswick Television, and I'm here with author Michael Aaron Rockland, whose latest book is a revised edition of The George Washington Bridge, Poetry and Steel. This book first came out 12 years ago in 2008, but enough has happened to justify a new edition. Rockland's early career was in the U.S. diplomatic service, where he served as a cultural attaché in both Argentina and Spain. Currently, he is a professor at Rutgers University. Rockland is the author of 10 previous books, some of which have received special recognition. He's a contributing editor at New Jersey Monthly and has worked in both film and television. He has lectured in some 21 countries around the world. However, it's my pleasure to welcome Michael Rockland to our studio today. Michael, what made you want to write a book about the George Washington Bridge in the first place?
Well, first of all, I spent the early part of my life across the river in New York, and most of my adult life on this side, that is the Jersey side. And so that was always my bridge. And as a boy, my friends and I used to walk across it before Fort Lee became an enormous place of high-rises.
Yeah.
It was the country, and we would walk across, and my friends and I, and camp out in the woods right there. And then my father got me an erector set, and on the box of the erector set for many, many years, perhaps still, I don't know, there's a picture of a father and a son working on a tower of the George Washington Bridge. So I always had a sort of a love for the bridge. And then to top it off, I decided I want to read a book on the George Washington Bridge. And so I went to my public library, and there was no book on the George Washington Bridge, but there were about 10 on the Brooklyn. That made me kind of angry as a Jersey convert, let's say. And then did a lot of research and discovered nobody had written a book on the George Washington Bridge. Now, I consider the George Washington Bridge perhaps the most important bridge ever built, and ignored. I went to a symposium also, to add to this. I went to a symposium at Columbia on American icons. And they were going on and on and on about the Brooklyn Bridge. And I like the Brooklyn Bridge. It's got these nice Gothic little arches and stuff. But it can't compare, really, with the George and its importance in history. But it's ignored. That is the George. And so I raised this question at the symposium. I said, why are you talking about the Brooklyn Bridge so much and you haven't mentioned the George? And they laughed, actually, and somebody said, look where it goes, which was a New Jersey put-down.
Wow.
Of course, where it really goes is it goes all the way to San Francisco. You pick up Route 80 right there, and you're on a straight line to San Francisco. So part of it was some animus towards New York snobism. With regard to New Jersey, and I've always thought, well, forget what I always thought. Le Corbusier, the greatest architect perhaps of the 20th century, called it the most beautiful bridge in the world. Mies van der Rohe called it the most beautiful structure in the greater New York area. Well, and nobody written a word about it.
Well, that's pretty interesting, because, of course, there's also books about the Verrazano.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is kind of an amazing fact that you couldn't find a book about the George Washington Bridge. Yeah.
Yeah.
So follow-up question, That the original edition, it came out in 2008. It's now 2020. We're talking 12 years later. Why did you and Rutgers Press decide that a revised edition was necessary?
Well, much has happened in these 12 years, and I won't go into all of it, but the main thing, of course, is Bridgegate,
Yeah.
followed by Beachgate.
Yeah.
And the George became an internationally known bridge because of Bridgegate, more than for any other reason. I'd be traveling overseas and people say, "Oh, you're from New Jersey. That's where that bridge thing happened."
Refresh our memory. What is Bridgegate?
Oh, well, Bridgegate were thugs, let's say, who worked for Governor Christie. And they were punishing the mayor of Fort Lee, who was a Democrat, Mark Sokolich, because he wouldn't endorse Christie. You may recall...
Endorse him for governor?
Endorsed him for governor as he was running for his second term.
For re-election.
Yes, but his real aim was, and people thought at the time that he was the leading Republican candidate for 2016. Nobody ever thought about Donald Trump in any kind of serious way, and you may recall that Christie was attacked for spending 75% of his time in his second term out of state, traveling around the country. He was running for president, and he wanted to be able to say, "Hey, they love me in New Jersey. Even all these Democratic mayors love me." Now, there were other mayors who were punished in a similar way, but it didn't become public because the world's biggest traffic jam didn't happen in Jersey City and Hoboken, being two of the places.
Well, how did the traffic jam come about?
Well, the traffic jam came out this way. Of the lanes that you go through, pay your toll, or Easy Pass, or whatever, there are 3 dedicated to local traffic. Local traffic meaning Fort Lee itself and all the towns around it, basically Bergen County traffic.
Yeah.
And what they did is they moved the cones so that there would only be 1 lane for all of that traffic. And that traffic was serious traffic.
How did they justify blocking 2 lanes? What was their cover story? What did they say?
Well, at first they didn't know what to say. Later they said, "We're having a traffic study," which no one believes, of course. So you had people sitting in their cars for 4.5 hours trying to get across the George Washington Bridge, but more seriously, there were people in ambulances that were waiting to go across the river to be operated on in New York hospitals. There were accidents where the cops couldn't get there. It was the first day of school in Fort Lee, and the school buses couldn't get across town. There was a woman who had a heart attack. Maybe she'd have died anyway, but she died. There was one thing after another.
So this was basically to punish the Democratic mayor of Fort Lee because he didn't endorse Christie.
Exactly.
Now it's my understanding Christie denied any knowledge of this at all. He just said, "Well, I don't know." Do you believe that denial?
Not for a minute. We got to remember that he took $11 million of taxpayers' funds and hired a law firm, that law firm being the main contributor to his campaigns, paying them $900 an hour to write a 340-page report to prove that Christie had nothing to do with it. Now, if you had nothing to do with it, why? Maybe a 3-page report would be enough. He protested too much, obviously. He also had a 2-hour press conference, which was unusual for him, in which he carried on about people think that I had something to do with it. I had nothing to do with this, but I don't accept that for a minute.
So you don't find the denial plausible?
Not at all, not for a minute.
Is the litigation over the Bridgegate scandal still going on?
It's amazing. It was considered a federal crime because it was considered interstate commerce, the bridge going between two states. And there were 3 defendants, the 3 people who worked for him, basically, who did this. One of them, David Wildstein, decided to tell the truth, and he got off with this, and he was the main perpetrator, by the way, and he got off with a slap on the wrist. The other 2 continued to deny it, and they were found guilty of 9 federal offenses. Then they appealed to the appellate division in Philadelphia, which covers this part of the country, and the appellate division found them guilty of 7 of the 9, reduced their sentence by a month or so. And at this point, Baroni decided, that's it, I'm going to jail, I might as well start it and get it over with so I can get on with my life. So he went to jail for 3 months. Bridget Kelly's attorneys continued to appeal. And then, to my great surprise, and that of just about anyone I've ever spoken to, the U.S. Supreme Court decided to put it on their docket for this year. And it is actually scheduled for January 14th. Whether it'll happen then or not, I don't know. And whether they'll actually hear the case or not, but it's scheduled to be heard. It may be dismissed at that point, and then it's all over.
So I guess you and the publishers were sort of torn. Were you tempted to wait till this is all resolved before you published a new edition?
That's a really good question. I kept begging them to give me the book back. I mean, the presses were turning, you know, and as you know, there are you can't make changes. You certainly can't elongate a page. If you put 1 comma in,
it'll throw it off.
The whole book is off. And I did talk them into at least giving it back to me, so that in 1 paragraph, by cutting other words out of the paragraph, I was able to put in a sentence about it is going before the Supreme Court. But obviously, the Supreme Court could be with this thing for the next 2 years. And,
so you just ran out of patience, ran out of time.
Well, both the press and I agreed, let's go with it. We know it's before the Supreme Court, that's enough. And who knows when they may hear this case next week and not issue a verdict until, let's say, next summer. So
anyway, getting back to the contemporary period, how many vehicles cross the George Washington Bridge every year?
About 106 million.
Does that make it the busiest in the world?
The busiest in the world by far. And it's, you know, it's 89 years old. Look, they tore down the Tappan Zee, they tore down the Goethals.
That's right.
They were 50 years old. The George was built so strongly, for reasons I could tell you, that it's expected to last maybe another 125 years. And at that point, maybe just like with an old car, the repairs become so costly. But right now, for example, as we speak, they're replacing the stringer cables, which come down from the big cables and hold up the upper deck. And the lower deck which was put on 31 years after the upper deck, is bolted to the upper deck. So it was built unbelievably stronger than any bridge had ever been built before.
I understand it's called a suspension bridge. What does that mean?
Well, if you can handle this analogy, imagine a clothesline. You want to put up wet clothes. We didn't have dryers. Or there are people who believe if you hang your clothes out in the sun, then your family will get lots of vitamin D. My mother believed that, by the way. So let's say you put a pole in the ground here and a pole in the ground here, and you stretch a rope between them. Now, if you were to hang wet wash, which is what the upper deck and the lower deck is, let's call that the wet wash. If you were to hang wet wash on that rope, what would happen? The two poles would just collapse inward. So what do? You stake them. And that's exactly what the George Washington is. It's staked, if you will, in the anchorage that was built in the Palisades. Luckily, the Palisades were there. On the New York side, they had to build a mountain, if you will. You don't see it, it's underneath there, in order to bring these 4 huge cables, which go all the way across. And on each end, each cable breaks into 80 bunches, like so. And they each anchor in different places in the mountain on the Palisade side, or in this concrete mountain on the New York side.
Well, I like your clothesline analogy. That helps clear it up. Some say the George Washington Bridge was never finished. Is that true?
That is correct, and lucky for us. Othmar Ammann, the Swiss immigrant who built the George, and built 6 more bridges in the New York area, including his last one, the Verrazano. He really wanted to build a bridge that looked like the masonry of the Brooklyn Bridge, except a big one. And Brooklyn Bridge is a toy in size compared to the George. Okay. And he built the bridge so strong, the towers, these magnificent Deco towers. In fact, he wasn't thinking Deco, but it's now considered just perhaps the most Deco structure in the world. He built the towers as he did because the point was to envelop them in concrete and then to face them in granite. It was 1931. The Depression was here. Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, and he and the New Jersey governor, Harry Moore, agreed, let's open the bridge. We don't have any money to... And so, ironically, the George Washington Bridge was built 1 year faster than the timetable and cost several $1 million less than it was going to cost. That must be the only project in history that came in early and
under
for
budget.
Less money.
Yeah.
So that's why the towers are so massive, because they were meant to hold all that concrete. And by the way, there are 2. There was the top, and then the bottom was put on in '62. And most engineers believe that the George towers are so strong, and the cabling is so strong, that you could put a 3rd level on the George. Of course, the problem is the approaches. What would you do? Knock down half of Manhattan and half of New Jersey to do it? That's the problem. So I don't think that'll ever happen.
So a lot of art historians say it actually looks better without the cladding.
Yes, it became this great icon, if you will, of modernism. And
because it's an honest expression of steel strength.
Yeah, and that's why my subtitle of the book is Poetry and Steel.
Exactly.
Because we don't think of steel and poetry as going together. We think of them as almost opposites. And to me, the George is so gorgeous that steel has been turned into poetry.
And Michael, how did you go about writing this book?
Well, I hung out on the bridge a whole lot. and by the signs all over, no loitering on the bridge. So the cops would stop me and say, "What are you doing?" And since 9/11, by the way, the issue of security is much more manifest. And so they're looking at me like, am I a potential suicide, or am I trying to blow up the bridge? After a while, they got to know me and knew I was that one guy that was allowed to be on the bridge at any hour, for as long as he wanted to.
Talking about hanging out, there's one time you actually climbed up to the top. How'd that work out?
Well, the best thing about that story, I think, is that if you plan something, it's not as interesting as if it happens to you. There are elevators in the towers. Nobody would know that, but of course there are elevators there because the workmen have to go up in elevators. And the elevators go all the way up to the top, and they go also all the way down to the bottom.
Okay.
Okay. And I had been to the top of the West or New Jersey tower in the elevators with the general manager of the bridge. He took me up there. And I said, you know, I really would like to get up to the top of the East Tower as well. He said, well, they're both the same. I mean, you know, it's not necessary. I said, I can't tell my reader they're both the same. Turns out they're not both the same for some very critical reasons, which I was happy to be able to talk about. But the day they arranged for me to go to the top, I was planning to go top of the East Tower. I was planning to go up in the elevator. And I arrived, and there were 4 special unit cops there, the emergency service unit cops, who were part of the president's security when the president of the United States comes to the New York area. These guys are like Navy SEALs, you know, and SWAT team guys and whatever. And there were 4 of them waiting for me, and I wondered, why are they waiting for me? They said, you ready, Mr. Rockland? I said, yeah. So they drove towards Manhattan, and then in one of these cut-throughs that if you and I did it, we'd be lucky to just be arrested. We'd probably get killed by the traffic coming the other way. But one guy got out, stopped all the traffic coming out of Manhattan. We went through there. And then they didn't pull up by the tower where the elevator is. They pulled up by the cables where they're heading down towards the New York anchorage. I still didn't get it. I hadn't, you know, so, and then they began to put all kinds of equipment on me, including a hard hat. Now, what a hard hat would do for you up at 604 feet in the air is beyond me, but all kinds of other gear as well, with 2 ropes that went out to the side with brass clasps. And I thought, what are they doing this for? What does this have to do with going? I still thought we were going up in the elevator. Nobody had told me otherwise. He said, you ready? I said, yeah, let's go. And I pointed to the tower. He said, no, we're gonna go up this other way. What other way? I said, didn't you want to go up? I said, yeah, I do want to go up. Okay, they opened the gate. These gates that have been put on since 9/11 so that nobody can go up there. And with 2 of them in front of me and 2 behind me, we began to walk up what eventually becomes a 45-degree angle, almost half of 90. I mean, you're walking with your feet here and your head way behind you. And a Sergeant Cottrell, who was behind me, said, you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. I wasn't okay. But he said, well, because if you're frightened, you know, we can turn around. I said, how do we turn around? And the way it is there are 2 little skinny cables that run along the big cable, and you're hooked onto them. But every 30, 40 feet or so, there are stanchions holding up that little cable. you have to unhook and go on the other side of the stanchions. But turning around seemed even more terrifying to me than that. So we just kept going, and we got all the way up to the top. And luckily, there are signs all over the George Washington Bridge since 9/11, no picture taken. But I had secreted in my pocket one of those little throwaway cameras from a pharmacy, you know? And I handed it to the guys in front of me, and they took these wonderful pictures of me with the other two guys behind me and Manhattan behind them. Or I wouldn't believe it myself that I went up there.
What? But I don't
if I
understand.
Didn't have the picture.
Is there no elevator on the East Tower?
Yes, there is, but there had been a misunderstanding. They had thought, I don't know where they got this misunderstanding. If they had asked me the day before, would I like to climb up there? I said, what, are you crazy? No, I wouldn't want to climb up there. But I couldn't quite bring myself to tell them.
Because they were all so nice and so prepared.
Yeah, and there were two in front and I thought, they can't let me die. They can't let me fall off here. I don't know how they're going to not let me fall off here, but I assumed that somehow it would be okay. The funny thing is we got to the top, and there's a door that lets you into what's called a saddle room. The saddle room is where the big cables come through and are bolted to the towers. And the door was locked. And we're standing there not knowing what to do, and I said to the lieutenant far back behind me, and he, in very rich language, doggone it, I forgot to tell him, and where's the guy who's supposed to be here, and opened the door, and anyway, he called Fort Lee. And then you could hear a police car racing with its siren across the bridge. It turned around, it came up the elevator, and then there was a scratchy sound. All of this about 20 minutes. And I'm standing there at the top of the cable. And by the way, the wind was blowing like crazy up there. There's nothing to protect you from the wind.
The door opens and you're able to take the elevator down.
Yeah, well, I would have loved to. By this time, I was no longer afraid.
Yeah.
And I would have been less afraid walking down than walking up, because I feel like I'm getting to safety rather than going away from safety. Yeah. But I didn't have time, because I also had an appointment with somebody who was going to take me into the New York anchorage. And I knew was waiting there, and so I went down in the elevator.
Well, that's quite an interesting story. It was sort of an interesting adventure as a result of miscommunication.
Right.
They just assumed that that's what you wanted to do.
Sure, if we'd planned it, then I would say, you know, ¿Quién es más macho? Look at me, I climbed to the top. Oh, I was scared the whole time, but...
Michael, thanks for sharing these stories. It sounds like a fascinating book.
Thank you.
But tell us, how can we get a copy of the book?
Well, it's a Rutgers University Press book.
Yeah, I guess you can get it on Amazon, and you can buy it through bookstores.
Yeah, you can get it through any bookstore. You can get it through Amazon, or you can get it directly from the press. I mean, all you got to do is call up Rutgers University Press, and they'll send it to you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing these stories.
Oh, please, thank you for having me. It was great fun.